Welcome to episode 57 of Fizzy's Wacky World of Wrestling. Folks, it's been a while since I've gone international with this particular podcast. I usually tend to focus on things. Hold on 1 second. There we go. I forgot that thing comes on occasionally. There we go. Folks, it's been a while since I have last done anything involving in international waters. For example, at this particular point in time, I really haven't talked that much about the British wrestling scene compared to, say, Japan or Mexico, or how the indie wrestling scene in the United States tends to resemble more of a flaming dumpster fire at times. Granted, there are some pockets of good promotions and some great areas to watch wrestlers perform their craft without having to worry about them breaking their necks all their time. Hint, Western New York. So anyway, I've been meaning to talk about this since November of last year, when the story broke that WWE was quite interested in the United Kingdom. Oh boy. In a deal that I feel as though is a little bit more risky than, say, allying yourself with a questionable nation in the middle of the Middle East. Even they are questioning the logic behind this idea. But let's go back a little bit ways. Back to the land known as the 1980s. Our story begins with the downfall of the British wrestling scene, a scene that had been carried by Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks, Kendo Nagasaki, and brilliant technical performers like Jim Breaks and the rest. Unfortunately, their time had passed. They had been carrying the scene since the 1970s. Where have we heard this before? Carrying a scene for 10 years longer than it's supposed to because the talent that you supposedly were banking on had all sorts of issues. It's almost like a repeat of the American scene in the 1990s. But regardless, their time had passed, and British wrestling was becoming less and less interesting for most people in their households. Why? A number of factors. TV rights revenues, TV networks and bosses of those networks no longer being interested in showing wrestling on the television, and also several other forms of sport were gaining a large amount of popularity. There's always been football, which we Americans call soccer, and auto racing was beginning to have a surge in massive popularity around this time period in the 1980s. The British touring car scene was drawing record ratings. British wrestling was considered something old-fashioned, even though they could see the likes of Johnny Saint and the like do technical wrestling holds, or young uprising stars like William Regal or Fit Finlay showcase their technical brilliance. They weren't interested in that. They wanted something more explodey. They wanted something more interesting than something that was being shown in a smoke-fueled arena with wrestlers being heckled by angry grandmas, taking their kids to Sunday school. After the day of Sunday school, it is. British wrestling has always been a very interesting subject for me. How it fell apart in the 1980s, of course, due to the influence of American wrestling. WWF has often been cited as being one of the reasons as to why British wrestling fell, but this is not necessarily true. The die had already been cast in the late 1970s with the British recession of the 1980s. Everybody was looking to get into something more high octane and high performance, like racing, for example. So the British wrestling scene sat dormant for nearly 20 years, a scene that was basically on life support near consistently, being supported by a small, religious, zealot group of fans known as the British wrestling scene. If you interact with a British wrestling fan on Twitter or any of the like, they are friendly, kind, but they're also the kind of people that you would never want to cross in a dark or brightly lit alley. They're nice, kind folks, in my experiences. But they're also people that have been hardened by decades upon decades of failure, which makes this latest news of Forte into the world of professional wrestling a little bit of a grim proposition. Why? Well, as the 40-mile-per-hour winds gust outside my house at 8:29 p.m. in the evening, let's dive into that. The latest problem that has emerged between the British wrestling scene is yet again a more American investment. WWE, now rechristened with the E and the F has been kicked to the curb, is now interested in the British wrestling scene after seeing what Impact, yes, TNA Impact of all companies, did when they invested in the United Kingdom back in 2013-14. A few years ago, Impact ran a show called British Boot Camp, which brought over stars like Rockstar Spud and was the genesis of the beginning of Marty Scurll's career into professional wrestling. He was known as Party Marty back then. This was a promotional element to bring new stars over into Impact because Impact was debuting itself as something of an international show representing international wrestling. Gee, sounds like early 90s era WCW, which it was. Exactly. Early 1990s era WCW. Where there was a high focus on international superstars from Europe, Mexico, and Japan to counteract the cartoony characters of WWE at the time, when they were known as WWF. Of course, Jim Herd goes in, decides to try and replicate the cartoon characters, but there always had been a sense of realism with WCW. For Britain, it was very much the same thing. They attempted to try and do things their own way. In what I have dubbed, basically the British wrestling scene, I've dubbed it British Leyland. Now, for those of you who are unaware about your motorcar history, I've dropped you several hints that we're going to be focusing on automotive-related things today on this podcast. British Leyland was a massive conglomerate of automobile manufacturers that was brought together into one group because of the fact that a steel tycoon had decided that it would be a good idea, since he owned all the plans to all of the automotive companies, since he had taken over as boss in the 1960s, that to merge them all together into one. And that would be British Leyland. Oh boy. British Leyland is a disaster of its own accord. If you've ever heard or seen anybody talk about General Motors cars in the 1970s, British Leyland cars were actually worse than the GM products. I don't think the sign of reputable quality would be a Triumph sitting on the side of the road waiting for its engine to cool down. That was British quality. Or a Austin Rover having its bottom completely cave in and causing the driver to fly out of the car holding a steering wheel and its seat in hand. That's British Leyland quality. Not to the level of Lancia, which had worse rust problems in the 1980s, but still kind of bad. Or the ingenuity that was the Austin Maestro. The Austin Maestro, the first car with a square steering wheel. No, I'm not kidding. You need to take a look. Or the time that they decided that they were going to make a car called the Triumph Stag and fuse two motors together to order to make it more powerful because they couldn't license the Buick V6 motor for some reason because another division of it had it. Yep. Oh boy. British Leyland is a source of comical ineptitude among the Brits. There are some people who quite like British Leyland, mind you. There were some good cars that were made from this company, but it's mainly known for the massive mistakes and being sold to the Americans and the Germans in the 1980s. Oh boy, and guess where WWE has ended up in the situation? They've ended up like Ford and BMW before them, having to pick up the pieces of an industry that seems completely bent for, well, completely crashing into the side of a hill and releasing a pen of sheep. Where do we start? Well, let's start with the revival. No, not Dawson and Dash, who politicaled their way into a WWE Tag Team Championship run because they were threatening to go to AEW. Seriously, everybody and their grandmother has been signed to that promotion already. Where's the former retired sumo wrestlers? Anyway, tangent aside, the promotion that is often credited with the revival of British wrestling was Progress, a promotion that claims itself to be a punk rock wrestling promotion. I buy that as much as I would buy a bridge over the Sahara Desert. It is not a punk rock wrestling promotion. It is a commercialized punk rock wrestling promotion. People call it indie, but it actually is more commercialized than WWE itself. What about promotions like Rev Pro, Fizz? Well, they're allied with New Japan Pro Wrestling. So they've ended up getting caught up by a trading card mogul who was then ousted for the former president of Coca-Cola Japan. This will go over well. Also, it's a guy who's Dutch. And the Dutch and the English have not exactly had the best relationship over their long and sordid history. It usually involves trading rounds of cannon fire and stealing their ships with the help of privateers, what we call pirates. Yes, this is a very tricky situation. So, how did it revive? Well, the grassroots movement. That's how it started. The locals got interested in pro wrestling again because fuel prices went up and auto racing suddenly became a less viable alternative. Football had been seen as something a little bit up too on the violent side, and the cost had gone up. If you take a look at the salaries of soccer players, footballers, if you're from Europe, then you'll note that their prices have ballooned exponentially. It's like the Hindenburg, except it hasn't exploded yet. So, because of the fact that there was a need for cheap alternative entertainment in areas that had rec centers and areas that had rooms for 10 by 12 rings, seriously, the British wrestling rings in that area are much smaller than what we Americans would consider in this particular instance. So they revived themselves in 2005-6 and started going along their merry way. Promotions began to pick up steam. The Britain survived the recessions of 2007 to 2009, while America got hit hard by them, and basically continued on its merry way until the early 2010s, where progress began to pick up more steam in this particular instance. It was at the same time, ICW, also known as Insane Championship Wrestling in Scotland, was also picking up momentum. These two promotions were going to lead Britain into a new golden age of professional wrestling. Well, so far, it hasn't ended up exactly how everybody expected. First and foremost, there was a grand expectation amongst the British wrestling community that Progress and ICW would remain independent, that they would not be gobbled up by the evil, tyrannical promotion known as WWE. I have a seething suspicion that the owners of these two promotions, along with many other promotions in the United Kingdom, wanted to get out of the industry before the bubble burst, as it often does in these situations. Because, in all honesty, the bubble burst in this situation. Britain got hit by a massive recession, as well as the fact that they've been currently having a lot of issues with their government. You might have heard of it. It's called Brexit. They want to separate from the EU, the European Union. And in all honesty, it's becoming a very, very bad situation with both sides having enough bodies to fill a closet at this point. It hasn't gotten to violence levels yet, but it's basically in the metaphorical stages, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. So, what exactly is going on with the British wrestling scene? Well, to be quite frank, they overspent. Progress and ICW overspent on contracts. They brought in a lot of journeyman wrestlers or wrestlers who had such bad amounts of baggage. Hello, Bram, we're going to be talking about you now. That they were nigh unsignable for other promotions. Now, I know people oftentimes complain about the problematics in wrestling. The reason why problematics get signed to second-tier promotions is because they can't get signed to mainstream promotions. The reason why small-tier promotions do that is so that they have a permanent member of their roster that they can rely on for years to come. 2 to 3 years, or until they have to go in for a jail sentence because their probation ran out. In addition to the fact that a lot of the issues pertaining to the British wrestling scene, the harassment of trainees by trainers, which has become a relatively well-known problem in Britain at this point, not just in wrestling, but in other fields of sport and athletics. The other issues in pertaining to money. Where is all this money coming from? Where's all this money going? Why do I feel like if I started digging deep into those questions that I would probably have my legs broken by somebody who looks like that they would be starring in a Guy Ritchie film? The British wrestling scene is the equivalent of Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. It's a scene filled with a lot of questionable individuals that you have to wonder to yourself, what in the heck are they doing here? And more importantly, well, basically at this point, it's becoming the equivalent of Midsummer's murders. Everybody is pointing fingers at one another, blaming each other for the mess that's going on in the scene, with WWE having taken over and it has embraced a new era of wrestling. Or a new dark ages of pro wrestling, depending on who you ask. So let's take a look at the first rumor. Everyone's blaming Vince. Vince is working on his fantasy football league. He has no time or any form of reason or substance to get involved with the affairs of the Brits. He's ignored the British market pretty much and has just put satellite promotions there since the 1980s. Or satellite coverage, based on his relationship with the various different British television providers, Sky Sports in particular, which, by the way, they are currently still trying to renew their contract with Sky Sports because that has gone nowhere. Apparently, it was supposed to be signed in the first quarter of 2019 and still has not gotten off the drawing board. That also tells you who is involved in the investment of the British wrestling scene for WWE. It's not Vince McMahon. It's George Barrios. George Barrios is the Shadow Emperor. He's the guy that has been doing a lot of money managing work to make sure that WWE expands into the global markets and it takes over the wrestling world. May thy wrestling gods save us from thy King of Kings. Because Triple H is also involved in this situation. The grand, glorious Pope of Wrestling, thy Savior, has come, like William the Conqueror in 1066 before them. Britain has been saved, or it has been doomed. As we've noticed in this particular episode, there's not a lot of middle ground in between. Unfortunately, we have a situation between a rock and a very hard place. Either you continue to let the James Bond villains that are the independent wrestling promoters of Britain continue to run around like chickens with their heads cut off, running around and causing all sorts of trouble and not actually building the scene up, who are basically looking for a quick fix. Signing their souls to WWE seemed like a good quick fix now, didn't it? In addition, WWE was spurned on when ITV, who had been formerly the kings of professional wrestling in the 1970s and 80s with their World of Sport, which not just covered wrestling but other sporting events in Britain, got themselves back into the game with World of Sport Wrestling. In addition, there was one very important keynote that ITV did that a lot of the other wrestling promotions, especially the bigger ones, are kind of worried about. They signed them to proper professional contracts, as in unionized contracts. Professional wrestling has long scoffed at the idea of unions in pro wrestling for decades, even though technically what they are doing in many of these situations is having an unofficial union. The boys, as they call it. It's a very strange situation where nothing seems to be official. Nothing has actually been written or set in stone. It's all under this veil of independent contractor work. And as somebody who has worked as an independent contractor in the field of merchandising for close to 15 years now, it's a very strange thing to be compared to a professional wrestler because a professional wrestler does something different than what an independent contractor does. A merchandiser, for example, comes into a store and sets up a display outside of the company or brings a bunch of stuff over for the employees to set up. It's not all that complicated, but it's also something that has created quite a bit of controversy, which is why a lot of stores these days have gone with in-store merchandising agencies. Just giving you a little bit of a peek into that world. So, the idea that ITV was doing all of these contract works and was suitably breaking ground was causing Mordor to go into a panic's tailspin. Because ITV was willing to offer health insurance and travel expenses being covered, which the wrestlers have to cover themselves if under WWE contract. It may sound like a bad situation, and it is to a degree, but let's also remember one very important thing. Why would an insurance agency want to cover a professional wrestler? is the question that I should be asking and everybody else should be asking themselves in this instance. They are people who willingly throw their bodies on the line for professional entertainment. Uh, they've called it a sport, they've called it entertainment. If I was an insurance agent, I would be extremely confused as to what exactly professional wrestling is and why exactly these people are jumping off of balconies and setting themselves through tables and flaming ladders. I'd be asking those questions. But I wouldn't, but that they're not asking those questions because professional wrestling is a carny industry. They don't want them to know about all of the little nuances in professional wrestling. What they want them to know about is, I don't know, what kind of shoe size that they have or something. It's a very interesting situation involving the UK because now we have a situation of a British wrestling promotion or promotions getting acquired basically by WWE as satellite promotions. Triple H's grand vision, if you would like to call it that, is the conquest of the wrestling world. I think somebody has been reading one too many novels of the Holy Crusades, but that's just my opinion there. He inspires himself to have a grand vision for professional wrestling, where WWE has a vested interest in every single international market that loves WWE related wrestling. They've been all big on the whole WWE Universe mantra for the last decade or so, because they're interested more so in the international markets than they are in the domestic United States market. Well, didn't that blow up in their face spectacularly, didn't it? Because now suddenly we have MLW, All Elite Wrestling, in theory at this point, they still haven't run their first show yet. Ring of Honor has rebounded by signing a ton of contracts. Impact is becoming the official wrestling promotion of Canada. And we also have to consider the secondary indie promotions that are starting to make a lot of headway in the market because WWE outpriced themselves out of the market. Seriously, if you outprice yourself out of the lower income market, then you're not going to do well as a globally trending wrestling promotion. You have to keep prices reasonable, even if it does mean that you make a lot less on the profits. Which, again, to the boys and girls in the back, is kind of a big concern for them because they want big paychecks. Because, again, wrestling is not exactly an easy profession to be in. It is a profession that is very difficult. Any wrestler will tell you that. And it's one of the few things that they will be legitimately honest with you about. Like, for example, Britain. You want to know the wrestling ages that usually happen in American wrestling? About 17 to 19, depending on the state. Some states are younger, some states are older. Some states, like Florida, don't really particularly care about age limits. Britain, 15. 14 to 15, they start them young. And I have a lot of questions about that. First and foremost, why would you want to be exposing someone that young to professional wrestling? Not as a fan, but as a wrestler. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. As somebody who cares about the safety of minors and youths in these cultures. And yes, there have been sexual harassment allegations against wrestlers who have been harassing minors. Yes, we've ended up yet again in another situation, much like what happened with episode 43, where we were talking about the fact that a Florida New Japan sponsored gaming convention promotion didn't do a due diligence and check to see if there were any registered sex offenders working on the show. We're in one of those situations, and it happened to be one of the half of the Progress Tag Team Champions at the time, which were the London Riots. Oh boy, one of the earliest success stories for Progress was the London Riots, a well-conditioned tag team that got into the storyline angle with Jimmy Havoc. I'm trying not to spoil too much about Progress's successes, but Havoc's storyline was one of the biggest deals for the promotion at the time. It's one of the many reasons as to why they were able to run in Wembley all those years later. Was the work that was done by Havoc, Will Ospreay, another person who has a lot of issues. But that's the problem with the Brits. The wrestlers that they built around are a lot of people who have a lot of issues. The kind of people who would be the kind of people who would sell their grandmother off just to get a wrestling ring. You're dealing with the literal equivalent, and the wrestlers themselves, they're just trying to make ends meet. They're trying to support their families in some cases. A lot of them wrestling well past their prime in order to do so because that's the only industry that they know. And any other industry that they get into, they don't really do very well for the longest of times. However, and this is a bit of a problem, the thing is that you also have the British wrestling promoters. They also caused this situation by spending way too much money and not reinvesting into their product. Progress is a major offender of this. Why in the literal HE double hockey sticks are you running in Australia? Do you want to know the number of live events that Progress ran last year? You might be thinking, oh, 20. It's an independent wrestling promotion. They don't have a lot of capital. Oh, that would be off by quite a bit. They ran 28 events in 2017. In 2018, they ran 42 events. Only 12 of those events were co-sponsored by another promotion. They basically did a WWE-esque touring schedule in their market and several other markets, including a very costly trip to America for a show in Boston, Massachusetts, where one of their performers, Kid Lycos, ended up getting injured in a hardcore match. At this point, the synonymous names of Kid Lycos and an iron lung are synonymous with one another, unfortunately. I like the wrestler. I like Lycos. He keeps getting injured, though. And past a certain point, you have to ask the question, why hasn't he changed his high-risk style yet? And yes, some of the injuries he's suffered have been freak accidents. But again, ask yourself the question, if Britain is such a technical-minded wrestling territory, why not do more technical moves? Save yourself for the big matches. But that's the thing. British wrestlers will either go all in, and that was not a pun for AEW, or they'll just do British technical stuff. Or they'll do Indies 2000 style moves, which brings us to the next problem, the ECW influence. Because Britain has decided to do a DIY style influence, that means that they're importing a lot of stuff and techniques from other areas. Japan and the Americas are two places that they've inspired a lot of influence from. Lucha Libre, Japanese technical wrestling with high impact moves, as well as American hardcore wrestling, a la ECW, has become more popular in Britain. It fits the grungy pub bar atmosphere that they've been trying to attract, which is another big issue in this particular instance. The British scene has divided a lot of their audience. There are those who go to British wrestling shows to go to the children and family shows to bring their kids. There are those who go to the over 21 shows to have a drink, get into a bar fight, and see a lot of wrestling that is a little bit more hardcore and more towards an adult audience. The trouble with this mindset is that it's divided the wrestling scene into various different groups. And we know all too well about what happens when the Brits get divided about something. It becomes like the literal equivalent of medieval warfare. All these different groups under their own tabards and banners, fighting against one another for space, recognition, and basically trying to prove themselves to be the king and queens of professional wrestling in Britain. Currently, the independent promotions are fighting each other instead of cooperating, or have sold their souls to the devil in the form of WWE, and the devil is really starting to regret that purchase. You might have noticed that I've been talking about the fact that I seem to be of the opinion that WWE made a massive mistake here. They did. Why did you invest in a country that is about to go through an internal governmental civil war for the next 3 to 5 years? I get it. George Barrios has a bunch of friends in England who need somebody to invest in this British wrestling scene. I get that the British wrestling promoters are very concerned about the pound crashing because of how international finances work if they break away from the EU. I get that. I understand that. But at the same time, it's very odd to me to see in this situation a company do the same mistake that Ford did and BMW did with the remains of British Leyland. Instead of letting British Leyland properly dissolve or continue to be owned by that aircraft carrier, Lockheed, or continue to be owned by Lockheed Martin, instead they decide to buy Jaguar, Range Rover, and a bunch of others on Ford's end, and BMW ends up with Rover. All they really ended up doing was reskinning the most of the cars, if to Ford specs, or in the case of Rover, BMW specs, and trying to do something with this. But the damage had already been done. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of millions of pounds was wasted on British Leyland. For what exactly? A bigger foothold in a market that isn't really interested in buying German or American cars, for the most part? I mean, I could say a lot of different things about the United Kingdom, but the one thing is that they're very loyal to themselves. They're very loyal to their queen and country, despite the fact that they want to basically beat each other up with claymores at this point. Be it Scotland or Wales or the rest of General Britain. They've always seemed to have been a country to me that always has been united, which is why they're called the United Kingdom. But the wrestling promotions are not united. They were united for a few years there when it was financially beneficial for them to be united, but the minute the WWE dips their toes into the pool, suddenly it's like the Dark Ages all over again. And people are getting locked in London's tower. I mean, okay. If I am Triple H and George Barrios, I would have waited a year before permanently investing in the United Kingdom, but the plans had already been set in motion. They had launched NXT UK, which was the UK division of their developmental branch NXT. They signed a ton of wrestlers to tiered contracts, which is where the controversy begins. Tiered contracts basically, in some cases, restrict how a wrestler is going to be able to perform at these various different shows. For example, if one wrestler is signed to a max tier contract, it basically means that they're signed to NXT and that they can't work for any non-WWE affiliated promotions except without special permission. Or only work with promotions that have special WWE affiliation, or happen to be in Ireland, because for whatever reason, both the United British Wrestling Promotions and WWE have steered clear of OTT, as well as several other Irish-based promotions. Weird, but not surprising. Overall, it is a mess of a situation. We have the tiered contracts restricting wrestlers from making a living in their regional promotions and are stuck instead having to be jobbers or enhancement talent wrestlers or mid-carders in the NXT UK brand, a brand that is not very popular amongst the locals in some cases because it is an American-funded wrestling promotion. And the British and the Americans have never had a very good history with one another, despite their alliance with each other's in the recent world wars. People still remember the time the Brits burned the White House in 1812, or the time that we Americans dumped a bunch of tea in Boston Harbor in 74? Yeah. The Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 is still very much in the hearts and minds of both groups, because they had ancestors fight in both of those wars. So, what exactly is going on with Progress? Well, besides the fact that they've been hit by the injury bug consistently since they started out, with every single babyface champion they've had gotten injured or derailed by their storyline quirks. Progress is a promotion that is very interesting to me because it epitomizes the very worst traits of British independent wrestling. A need for excess, a tiny ring, and this sense of overhyping everything. WWE runs into this problem with NXT and their main roster programming, but it is also very apparent in Progress. They overhype everyone, desperate to try and get somebody definition over. They introduced championship belts without much of a plan. For example, apparently, spoiler warning, they may have decommissioned the Atlas Championship, a championship that was supposed to be for big hoss wrestlers, but instead ends up in the hands of the little wrestlers who aren't really Atlases or really large. And of course, NXT UK is in a desperate situation because they're having to invest in wrestlers that Progress basically put in their lower card. Guys like Dave Mastiff and Joe Coffey, who was working in ICW, are now being pushed up to the main event status of NXT UK because the definition of what Americans think a British wrestler is some big, burly industrial worker who looks like he's eaten a mattress. Or 5. And several heads of sheep. Seriously, British people look. A British wrestler in the eyes of the American looks like an industrial worker. It's not necessarily somebody who is, say, for instance, small or light. Although the perception of what an American wrestler looks like has changed with the modern era. A lot of modern era wrestlers are shorter. They look more human instead of the gargantuan beast of the 1980s, like Hulk Hogan, for example. When you look at what British wrestling has done at this particular point in time, it's this weird style of contrast. They're trying to present it traditionally, but they're also trying to go all hardcore and edgy with their product. ICW got consumed and possessed by an ECW playbook and has ended up going completely mad, wasting the careers of Kaylee Lee Ray and completely torpedoing any attempt at a babyface run by any of their top individuals. Also, they employ Bram, which is the ultimate sign of desperation for a wrestling promotion if you're employing a guy who literally gets into fights with cops. Although I think some of the anarchist fans would quite like that these days. Overall, it's a mess, as I've talked about extensively. It is a mess of a situation. WWE has invested into a territory that might be going for a War of the Roses situation in 5 years, into the 5 years. They've invested heavily in a market that is not interested in having a bunch of Americans run what is supposed to be a British industry, similar to what happened with Range Rover. With Land Rover, Range Rover in the 1990s. Similar to what happened to Jaguar when they also got bought out by Ford in the deal. Overall, it is a mess of a situation, and one that is probably not going to get any better anytime soon. And then, of course, that leads us to the cherry on top. NXT UK's first takeover. A takeover that was marred by a main event between Pete Dunne and Joe Coffey. I mentioned Joe Coffey before a little bit ago. Joe Coffey is a Scottish wrestler who's one of the main eventers for ICW. A guy who got immediately deep pushed the minute that WWE's deal with ICW became apparent. A guy who has been basically de-pushed by the home promotion to be sacrificed to the Americans. And it is shows. Coffey had a substandard match with Dunn because neither wrestler matches up with each other's styles very well. Coffey is a power wrestler and Dunn is a technical guy who can do power moves to guys who are much smaller than him. Or guys who are smaller than Coffey, at least, because Coffey's 6'3" and weighs about 250 to 300 pounds. It didn't work. The only thing that did work in that instance was the fact that they decided to sign Walter to one of those tier contracts. Walter is a wrestler that is not very interested of going out of his mainland Austria and Germany because he works as a trainer for WXW's Wrestling Academy. Another name that got themselves into the British wrestling puzzle was WXW, which is based in Germany. A promotion that is also dealing with its own problems of wrestlers who might be over the hill, as well as wrestlers who are going to be signed by WWE. We think. We're not exactly sure about that. See, that's one of the big mysteries about Britain and European market in general. There's a lot of mystery. It feels as though that you're back in the Dark Ages. Going into, darkened rooms with hooded figures doing sacrifices or something. Or just getting a bite out to eat. The British wrestling industry is very secretive to a degree. It's like basically if the Knights Templar were running a wrestling promotion, which is exactly what a lot of these British wrestling promotions are. Many of the smaller promotions are actually satellite promotions run by the wrestlers in some of the bigger British wrestling promotions. For example, Fight Club Pro is partially owned by Trent Seven, one of the British strong style, and is currently owned by a man named Martin Zaki, who looks like a James Bond villain. In fact, a lot of these British wrestling promoters look like James Bond villains. Yes, you want to certainly be trusting a person who would look at a place inspector with your money, is my question in that particular instance. And I know that I might be sounding extremely harsh towards the British wrestling industry as a whole, but I see what's going on with the American industry. You don't want to be copying the trends of the Americans in this particular instance, with many of them overspending large amounts of money on professional wrestling, a market that may or may not burst like the real estate market did back then, 10 plus years ago. Pro wrestling is either going to be entering into its next golden age or its next recession. And there have been some things that Progress has done right. For example, bringing in Australian and New Zealand wrestlers to fill out their cards to make Australia and New Zealand more viable markets for international wrestling. And fortunately, also making them viable markets for international takeover by WWE, although I think their coffers are kind of tied right now with all of the tire fires that Vince is having to put out now. Why? Because Vince has finally awakened this week and figured out that something was going on with NXT. This week, we saw the call-ups of Tommaso Ciampa, Johnny Gargano, Ricochet, and Aleister Black to counteract a ratings slump that apparently has been happening with their TV product as of late. I personally am okay with this move. Why? Because at least 3 of these people have been in developmental ranks for about, 3+ years in some cases, or have been in associate promotions for 4 years, and that it was time to bring them up to the main roster so that they could actually make some money up there. I know a lot of NXT wrestlers are kind of paranoid about going away from the golden promised land that is Full Sail University, the devoted cult of fans that loves their every move. And of course, everybody was complaining about the fact that the crowd at Raw didn't react well to the NXT wrestlers. Well, why would they? This is the general wrestling audience. This is not people who watch NXT on the regular. These are not people who own the WWE network in some cases. They just go to a regional wrestling show to have fun. And in this case, they didn't know who Tommaso Ciampa, Johnny Gargano, Aleister Black, and Ricochet were. And that's not really their fault to an extent. It's more a fault of WWE not really promoting them all that well, or really understanding what exactly they're doing with their promotions. Case in point, like I've said, WWE UK. I mean, seriously, the idea that this investment into the UK is such a it's such a disaster dominoes at this point. Every time that they try to undo another domino, another one falls apart. Or gets stuck, or ends up in a situation where you're like, what exactly is going on here? What is this? What do you mean you don't have this kind of money? What do you mean you've been inflating attendance records to showcase that your product is worth investing into? I mean, if I was George Barrios at this point, who recently sold $49 million of investment in WWE, which apparently indicates that he's investing into this UK project himself. And if I'm him, I would be taking a look at the numbers very carefully right now and saying to yourself, is this investment worth it? Now, I know people are going to be saying, well, at least it's better than investing in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a very clear-cut rules and regulations about what they're doing at this point, okay? It's a Middle Eastern country that at least is stable. Britain is not at this point. And it confuses the heck out of me as to why, in this particular instance, why WWE is investing into a country that looks like it's on the brink of civil war. And the wrestling promotions within it. Promotions that seem... Nothing makes sense here, in all honesty. Nothing realistically makes sense to me. And I'm a person who pays attention to numbers and trends. And nothing about this market makes any sense to me. They have not been investing into the future. They have not been investing into the present. They've not been investing in improving the venues. There have been repeated cases of people complaining about the fact that there's a lack of accessibility for disabled fans to go to wrestling shows. There have been people complaining about the fact that a lot of these British wrestling promotions use strobe lighting, and those who have epileptic seizure issues have been getting blinded by it. You have situations involving arenas that are they're having these shows in bars in front of 100 people. I mean, it's a viable market if you're into really independent grunge music, or third or fourth wave music, folk music, but it's not really viable if you want something for the general consumer. I know that I've been harping on this for quite a bit, but where's the general consumer market for British wrestling? There isn't much of one, apparently. Or if it is, it's been driven away by the hardcores, which is very much the same thing that's been happening with the American market. A market that seems to be predominantly dominated by the hardcore market, or those who think that they're hardcore, but in actuality are just the minority in that situation, of fans in that situation, instead of targeting to children and families. That's where wrestling made a lot of its money back in the olden days, was in families. Families going to a cheap wrestling event that cost next to nothing to see 5 to 10 matches on a card involving a bunch of wrestlers. Back then, you could afford that. And even now, today, you can afford to go to an independent wrestling show for $30, bring 2 people there for $30 or so, and have a good time. Or a family for free. If if the general admission price is like $10, you can bring a family of free over to an indie wrestling show, and that frees up a lot of cash for people to be able to spend money on the merch tables. I don't know if the markets for that Britain has is necessarily sustainable long term. That's been one of the biggest questions that everybody, not just the hardcore, has been asking. And I think WWE management's been asking this question because the United Kingdom run that they've had so far has been a bit of a bust. It's drawing even less views than 205 Live does, which is strange to think about. And that's the Cruiserweight show. And with the latest reports of guys like Norm Dar and Mark Haskins ending up injured again, because apparently yesterday they were at a show and Noam Dar was at a show, and apparently there was a spot that went wrong. We'll have to hear more information about it, but we thought I'd bring that up. I mean, I know that the title of the video is May Thy God, Wrestling God Save Us from Thy King of Kings, but Hunter has invested into something that I don't think is particularly sustainable long term. Neither's Japan. They're not going to be interested in a market that is owned by a bunch of foreigners. China? Maybe. Maybe China. Because there isn't much of a wrestling market right now. But they are interested in pro wrestling. And given the strides that OWE has been making in the market, I would not be surprised if there was any form of general long-term investments into the Pacific markets like that. Now, Japan has always been a question mark because many of the Japanese wrestling promotions have been kind of up for sale for a while now, but again, that's always a kind of a big question. Is to whether or not invest in these markets or just wait a little bit longer and see if the market changes. Because right now what we have is a company that has their home attendance is down, their house show attendance has gone down because they have outpriced themselves out of the general market. Never outprice yourself out of the cheap market, because if you outprice yourself out of the cheap market, you're not going to make any major money. You have an audience that is divided, a main roster audience that's divided and is fighting with the hardcore fans of NXT. The indie fans are fighting with everybody else. Everybody's going out kung fu fighting. Except for this here host who's sitting here watching the 40-mile-per-hour winds gust by his window and is wondering, what the heck is everybody doing here? There is no center, there is no calmness, there is no peace, tranquility, or mind. There is instead barbarian fightings over a scrap of meat and some gold coins. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I know that I've oftentimes been made jokes of Fizz making sense, but in this case, what Hunter has acquired, what Triple H has acquired, is a massive problem. A scene rife with corruption, a scene rife with questionable individuals, and a scene rife with all sorts of issues. From financial structural issues to a government that is about to collapse. I don't know if the wrestling gods will save us from thy King of Kings, but the King of Kings will hope that God save him from the Queen. Because you've invested into a market that is more perilous than investing into a 10-year partnership with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And even they are having regrets about this deal because they're the ones that offered it in the first place. So anyway, besides all of the questions, so this is just an observation that I've had about the British wrestling scene, taking a look at it from the perspective of somebody who is very confused as to why, not necessarily confused as to what they're doing, because I think I'm kind of wise to what they're doing. They're basically, like I said, they're passing the bucket of problems off to somebody else. And it happens to be those incompetent Americans that run WWE that are currently dealing with the situation. And WWE has never really been particularly good about dealing with these kind of situations before. They usually just panic like everybody else would do in this situation. And I, quite frankly, am not surprised that they're currently panicking about this. I would be too. I know everybody's saying that WWE has a monopoly and they stranglehold over everything. No, they're a microeconomy. They are a company that heavily invests a lot of money into the regional areas so that they don't get their areas conquered by other entertainment ventures. The reason why Vince has been so aggressive about the whole entertainment thing is because his biggest competitors have not been other wrestling promoters. It's been concert promoters. And folks don't realize just how vampiric concert promoters are. They will literally destroy everything. If once they get a hand on a date that an arena is running, they never let go of that date unless absolutely necessary, or somebody buys out that date for a bigger price. And what Vince is having to do, and the reason why live show events are down to an extent, is because he's having to offer larger and larger contracts to the venues in order to hold these events in preferred dates ahead of the concerts and entertainment promotions. Concerts and entertainment promotions. If you understand the inner workings of how a wrestling promotion actually runs, you begin to figure out a lot of these little nuances. Vince is competing with the concert promoters. Vince is competing with the circuses. Vince is competing with all of these special events like Monster Jam, for example. Monster Jam is a competitor because they run in the same arenas that WWE runs in. Markets that for years WWE has been in and has been one of the few supporting parts of that market, because the independent scene is usually run by people that have next to no experience in any form of professional business. When I say professional business, I do not mean professional wrestling business. I don't mean them going all carny, as I've said before, but actually understanding and managing finances, running numbers, and employing a bunch of independent contractors to come to these arenas, to an arena that is hopefully built correctly, to a ring that is hopefully built correctly, to perform in front of a paying audience. They hope. Instead of an audience that is being brought in for free. The perils of independent wrestling. Then we have the second tier promotions that oftentimes don't understand that market and employ people They often employ the people that run in these regional markets to help them understand the market and to promote. And they have absolutely next to no idea. Like the time the TNA started doing a regular house show schedule and wondering aloud to themselves why they weren't drawing that many crowds. It wasn't just because their TV product was questionable at that moment, but because the fact is that they were in markets that, quite frankly, hadn't really been developed all that well. And now that question also applies to Britain. Can thy holy Pope of Wrestling, Triple H, save the British wrestling, much like William the Conqueror saved Britain in 1066 by conquering it? Or will he end up like Harold Hardrada and end up murdered on the battlefield? Also happened in 1066 as the Vikings attempted to conquer Britain. Because there is a lot of issues that they are currently dealing with. In addition to the fact that one of those safe markets that they thought they would have, Germany, is also going through some political issues. Political government issues. It's a lot like professional wrestling, isn't it? So, anyway, it has been 9:21 p.m. on the docket. And, let's see here. Let me reload this tab here and see how we are doing for time. We are currently a 56 minutes and 8 seconds into this broadcast. And I think I've talked enough about the British wrestling scene and whatnot, and some ideas about financials in a sort of abridged fashion because I don't have a script in front of me, but I feel like this has been a good show. So anyway, upcoming shows. Episode 58 and 59 will probably be more focused on WWE or something else. I have really no plans at this point as to what kind of shows I'm talking about. But I guess I should probably end this with, what does the future say? I'm a person who does not like to predict the future. The future is absolutely unpredictable, and anybody who tells you otherwise is lying for the skin of their teeth. What I can say with confidence is this. The British wrestling scene is going to be in a bit of a dark age period for a couple years. Now, dark ages does not necessarily mean it's going to be bad. There's some good promotions in Britain. And there are some wrestlers like Chris Brooks, who is the other half of CCK, who's taken it upon himself to be that guiding light in independent wrestling. Let's just hope he's not a false prophet like every other attempted savior that has come into the promotions at this point. Because that's the thing that the Brits have got to be a little bit worried about. False prophets. Everybody can claim everyone will claim to you that they will give you a pot full of gold, but instead all you end up with is a sack full of coal. Which, admittedly, will be good in the winter because you can actually use it for the fires, but nonetheless, that thing that might be gold might be fool's gold. Be very careful at this particular point in time. The Americans are the least of your problems right now. Your problems right now in the British wrestling scene are close to home. There's your own brothers and sisters in professional graps, who are each wondering to themselves, what am I doing now? You've invested all of this time, all of this money, all of this effort into hanging out with your mates at the bar, full of 100 people in a building that may or may not be regulated for a wrestling show. Watching a bunch of people in tights wrestle in front of a bar crowd. That wrestling will still be going on. But anything bigger than that, there's a big question mark as to whether or not it will actually be able to expand. Lord knows all of these arenas in Britain would benefit greatly for having a cheap alternative. And that's the thing I've been pointing out in this particular instance. You're not going to be making a ton of money doing this. What you're going to be able to do in this situation is you're going to be able to provide for lower income families who don't have entertainment options. Market to those people. Bring them in. Be inclusive. Be inclusive to all. It's not a marketing slogan. It's how you're supposed to do business in the first place. You market yourself to as many people as you need to in these situations. And then all of those other problems will go away. Or, more specifically, Could you please work with the Rawses for once? If you got problems with drunken fans at wrestling shows saying inappropriate things, it should be up to the venue security and the staff to let them know that these things are going on, not just going on a 15-page rant on Twitter. Seriously, I get that some of you are not particularly big fans of cops in that neck of the woods, but they do have mental health wards for a reason. To help out fans who have issues with these kind of things in crowds. Also, it would be behooved of me to talk about the other thing that I usually talk about on this show, which is why are there not any alternatives to alcohol at these shows? You know you're bringing in fans that have a lot of issues with the stuff. Why do you keep encouraging fans to drink instead of allowing them an alternative? Considering how big of health nuts, as I've said before, wrestlers are, the fact that there aren't any sort of like vegan drink alternatives at these shows, much like you would see at an Antiques Roadshow fair, is mind-numbing to me. You like all of this alternative, edgy stuff. Why not invest in something that might not just be good for yourself, but good for everybody else? Heck, it bring more families to shows. If you basically promised in that particular instance to close up the bar and let people have drinks that are non-alcoholic. That would be a nice little alternative. Now, what is it? Feel free to steal that idea, by the way. I'm not running any wrestling promotions at this particular point in time. I'm not doing anything involving professional wrestling up close. When you don't have any skin in the game, it makes it much easier for you to critique and look and analyze what the world of professional wrestling is doing. That's why I've always been so independent. Even though I have been a part of a community for years, I'm very much an independent personality and an independent voice. And either you'll listen to that independent voice or you'll just think of me as just yet another irrelevant wrestling commentator who's speaking in grandiose truths and trying to be as honest as he can be, which I'm doing at this point. But overall, I feel as though that pro wrestling, in general, is getting better. It's not going to be a gradual change. It's not going to be a quick and fast change. It's going to be a gradual change. A change that is going to take time and actual effort. Don't just say that I tried. Actually do. Actions speak louder than words. And your actions will define what you, as a person in this industry, do. Either you're actually going to be beneficial in these situations, or you're going to cut out everybody else's legs to benefit either yourself or some grand visionary promotion. Or you could just be like Mordor and be basically honestly, obviously evil, which that works too. And besides the fact that Mordor is in trouble, they're in just as much trouble as everybody else is. A lot of their finances hinge on the stock markets not crashing again. Which they better hope they don't. Because they've invested a lot of money in international projects. NXT India, NXT United Kingdom, NXT Arabia, NXT Taiwan, or China, or Hong Kong, wherever it ends up. NXT Japan. We're going to franchise this, baby. NXT Chile. And hopefully it ends up working out slightly better than what happened when Walmart went into the German market. They were out of it by 2007. I know a lot of people will complain about corporations and their evils and questions and this, that, and the other thing, but realistically, who is going to invest in these areas? People have given up. It's unfortunate to see people just basically sit around doing nothing while watching their communities burn around them. But that is the world that we live in, unfortunately. But either you're going to step up and actually do something positive for your community, like cleaning up that vacant lot, for example, or you're just going to sit around and do nothing and complain on Twitter. That's what 90% of wrestling fans do all the time anyway. What's stopping you now? Well, I'm going to basically go to the tune of the beat of my own drummer. And this has been episode 57 of Fizzy's Wacky World of Wrestling. May thy wrestling gods save us from thy King of Kings. I hope you have a great day or night. Please be careful on the roads tonight if you are living on the East Coast, because obviously there's a large amount of snowfall and massive wind going on. And also, let's see here. I don't really do as many plugs as I used to, primarily because I've become more inwards and have started to try and find my own voice. So I've been listening to less podcasts and wrestling lately. But I do want to mention that WrestleNomics Radio, done by Brandon Thurston, is still on the air and is still running. Brandon did an episode last week about WWE Q4 finances, the other finances that they're doing, specifically about their investment with Saudi Arabia, the Australian government, which is also fraught with perils, because again, it's Australia. It's a government that 1 minute will decide that one thing is legal, and the next minute decide to ban 50,000 things. Really not sure about what's going on in that situation. But anyway, if you want to get a more in-depth, detailed look on economic finances with graphs and pictures, you might want to go look at WrestleNomics Radio. You can follow them at WrestleNomics. They recently had a change in staff. Chris Harrington, a longtime voice of WrestleNomics, got signed by AEW, and he has had to break away from WrestleNomics because it's a conflict of interest. You know, him covering finances of other wrestling companies probably would be an FCC violation or 5. Federal Trade Commission violation or 5. So, in order to avoid that, Brandon has gone solo with the podcast and has done 2 episodes so far. They're really good episodes. They're must listen if you want to be interested in the world of wrestling finances. If you want something that's a lot less abridged than what I've been doing here on Wacky World of Wrestling. But go check it out. I absolutely recommend it. As far as other podcasts that I currently have been not really listening to, but I could recommend in this particular instance, there have been some technical difficulties with another podcast that I have mentioned beforehand, Shooting the Breeze. They had a episode that did not air in February, but they're back at it. Senju is still shrugging away there. You may have heard of him beforehand on a past episode, Mr. Dr. Senju. He's still trugging away with the podcast with Taker's Minion and associated amounts of guests. Like I've said beforehand, Wacky World of Wrestling is not affiliated with Los Ingobernables de Podcast. I am an independent podcaster first and foremost. And also, this was mentioned to me in the comments section of the nightly thread on Cage Side Seats. They were asking a question about Cage Side Speaks. Currently, the podcast is on hiatus. I'm still doing some work about still trying to get some things sorted out with that podcast, but who knows? Maybe later in the year we'll be seeing yet another edition of Speaks. But until then, we still have Wacky World of Wrestling. And this has been episode 57 of Fizzy's Wacky World of Wrestling. May thy wrestling god save us from thy kingdom come, or King of Kings. And this has been William Fizzpatrick. You can follow me on Twitter at Fizzpatrick14. That's Fizzpatrick. Ritrick. And there shall be an episode link on the channel. And I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Fizzy's Wacky World of Wrestling. This is a little bit more of a outside-the-box experimental episode that I've done. And I hope to see you all for the next edition of Wacky World of Wrestling. And I don't know what I'm covering next for episode 58. But it will be something relatively interesting, I think. Until then, have a good day or night and drive safely. For those of you who are on the East Coast dealing with this current windstorm/blizzard. And I hope that my power doesn't go out because of the 40-mile-per-hour winds. Anyway, have a good day or night, and I'll see you next time. Bye!